Thank you very much, Ankit, for this excessively generous introduction. Let me present a few thoughts which I have been nurturing for many years, and they've been growing in intensity as the problems also grow in intensity. It's nothing new. The thoughts are not new. The problem is not new, and yet we seem to be rediscovering everything almost every day. We lack this greater perspective that I personally found in an Indian background, but of course other thinkers, and I will show a few examples, have found in their own ways. And I wish to discuss the present world crisis, limiting myself perhaps through the angle of the environment, because this is something that is of immediate concern, and it is something that is growing in urgency, undoubtedly. I would like to share a few points briefly through my slides, and then I will unshare my screen and discuss them more in depth for a few minutes. So the whole question is, are we on a sustainable path or not, or can we be? And this key word of sustainability, which, if I remember right, was coined by Ernst Schumacher in the 1970s, or perhaps by the Club of Rome, I will come back to them, is the critical issue. And first of all, a few simple facts which we tend to forget because we are obsessed with very limited issues like temperature rise or a few more. First of all, the extension of species. We do not realize to what terrific speed the natural world around us is simply dying. And this is a figure. There are many others. We have a lot of dire statistics around us, but basically the extinction is somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 times faster than what it would naturally be. And of course, the Earth, the planet, has always been renewing its flora and fauna, but this present phenomenon is something whose consequences are totally incalculable. We are part of a chain of ecological mechanisms, and we are not separable. We cannot be isolated, though we may be on the 10th floor of a high-rise building in a city. We will be affected eventually by the disappearance of a small vertebrate and even perhaps a small insect species at the other end of the planet. This statistics about pollution is crushing. It is extremely depressing, and we are not addressing those issues. We are just killing not only the land, the air, but more importantly, perhaps the ocean, which is very far, again, removed from our daily concerns, and yet so critically important. So this is without comment, but the result of our activities, and these are very complex cycles. It's not just about plastic waste. It's about also dumping fertilizers in the oceans and other chemicals. And it's the creation of dead zones, that is to say, huge expanses of the oceans and expanding ones that are now deprived of oxygen. So if I may be allowed to put it dramatically, the oceans are dying. And once again, we may not feel connected to them, but we are, and we will suffer the consequences. And therefore, for also all kinds of other reasons, especially at the level of economics, which I will barely touch upon, a number of voices are heard to tell us that these so-called sustainable development goals of the United Nations are in all likelihood unsustainable. In fact, if we are truthful, if we look at ourselves honestly and without trying to be either alarmist or optimistic, nobody knows today what sustainability is. Nobody today can declare that this particular practice is going to be sustainable. We can only speak of the short term. We just do not have the vision, and this is something I want to come back to in my conclusion. And therefore, we know, and this is something that many organizations, this Global Footprint Network in particular, have documented with a wealth of statistics, which we usually do not look at because it becomes a bit too depressing. Therefore, we are already today using the equivalent of 1.7 planets, the resources that 1.7 Earths, our planet, can realistically provide. So we are, again, to put it very simplistically, we are living beyond our means, economically, ecologically, socially, at all levels. We are overexploiting this planet, and this is going to be more than twice by 2030, which is almost upon us. And we just do not, actually, I don't think that we are even able to grasp the consequences of this. So, and of course, lastly, the one item, but again, the item which is a consequence and not a cause, the ultimate result in this long chain of complex, of course, chain of disrupted mechanisms of the planet is that we have experienced and are experiencing more and more global temperature rises and global rise in extreme events. But this whole talk, which we've been hearing a lot of 1.5 degrees, is actually nonsense. It is hypocritical. Our policymakers, some of our scientists also simply do not wish to look at the facts, but still a number of scientists and climatologists in particular have been telling us, especially after the Glasgow summit, that the minimum that will happen if all current commitments are met, which is not going to happen, of course, we know that, is a temperature rise of 2.4 degrees calculated as of now for the end of this century, which is catastrophic. And that also still hides a lot of unknowns. There are, what is known as climate loops, where one mechanism triggers another that again increases or feeds into the global warming. So this is very briefly, succinctly, and I believe not in any alarmist tone, this is the situation in front of us. Is it something new? Is it something that we never heard of? I remember when I was a kid in France, in the Sciences Naturelles class at school, perhaps not exactly elementary, just above elementary school, natural sciences. And there was one teacher in a small province town of France who was explaining how, carbon was captured by the geological foldings of the earth and became oil, petroleum products, basically. And how now, if we burn all this oil, we might be going back to the time when the earth was very, very warm and there was so much of carbon in the atmosphere. So this was somewhere in the 1960s. And therefore, because he was not particularly an advanced scientist, but he was aware of the problem that was already facing us. And therefore, there were already people looking at all this, but of course, with no chance of being heard. So I wish now to look at a few of these prophets, as I call them. They are called sometimes prophets of doom, and they were called prophets of doom in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. Today, nobody would dare to use this term anymore because it's almost as if the doom is upon us. So let's hear a few of them. And I have to be very brief, of course, so therefore I cannot do more than invite all of you to read them, to go back to these fundamental works, which described the whole issue in such lucid terms long before even 1% of humanity became aware of them. So first of all, we have to mention the Club of Rome, and it's a very important, critically important booklet published in 1972, Limits to Growth. And again, the thesis was very simple, though it was fed by a lot of complex statistics of economics. It was that we have a finite planet. We are living on a finite planet. We are already, in terms of population, demographically expanding far too fast. But apart from that, we are talking of endless growth, and this obsession with growth, which we find reflected everywhere from nations to corporate businesses with quarterly reports. This obsession is precisely what they were countering. And what they said was that we will not be able to sustain this endless race for growth for a much longer time. They were ridiculed. A lot of economists took cudgels with them and said that they were neglecting this aspect of economics and that aspect of, and in the end today, all these critiques are muted, and it is increasingly recognized that they were right. But as one of them was honest enough to say, we wasted 30 years before we started listening to them. Another voice, very important, at the same time, just a year later, was Ernst Schumacher, the famous author of Small is Beautiful, subtitled Economics as if People Mattered. Economics as if people mattered. And he says in the same thing in a sense, but especially he elaborated upon appropriate technologies and the fact that we must put human beings at the center of the whole economic system. He was advisor to the British government, and we must not put consumption at the center. This is a fundamental error, and we are still practicing it. David Orr, a famous environmental educationist of the US, who authored very important papers. I will not have time to dilate upon them, but one of them was subtitled Education as if Earth Mattered. So, of course, a paraphrase of Schumacher. And his point was that we must put environment at the center of education, all education. We should start from that and then branch off to all other branches of knowledge. We're still very, very far from doing it. Edward Goldsmith, a British economist and environmentalist, who authored a lot of very important writings and who warned us that the Earth, if we continue what we are doing now, will become unable to sustain complex forms of life, and so on. So none of them were heard, except for a very small minority. And therefore, in a nutshell, what is the problem? Can we sum it up, and can we look at now here inward at India and see what India has to offer us? I believe the whole problem is that we are unable to leave our human context. We are unable to look at what we are doing to this planet as just one species among many others. And even our climate activists very often have a very anthropocentric approach. They still put humans at the center of it all. We have broken this chain of living, of creatures, which ancient India was very aware of. Remember the Upanishads, all creatures are impelled by consciousness. All creatures are impelled by consciousness. This is the fundamental message of what you might want to call Indian ecology or environmental thinking. And we have to find ways to go back to it, of course, with practical solutions. But we have to stop looking at the consequences of what we are doing only as so far as they affect humanity. They affect the entire planet. That is the central perspective. And therefore, we find that there is a lot of insight in India into what should be our radical shift in perspective. This radical shift was also foretold by a certain number of thinkers. For example, recently, Gus Spert, a lawyer and scientist in the US, who rather said in an interview with the BBC, I believe, I used to think the top global environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change, exactly what we're hearing today. I thought that within 30 years of good science, we could address these problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. Now, this is in a nutshell, is the most important perspective that we need. That it's not a problem of science and technology. We are told constantly that technology will solve the problems that technology created. How can it be when our inner attitude does not change? It is that we must address if we really want a sustainable, permanent, lasting solution. And of course, before Gus Spelt, who speaks of a spiritual and cultural transformation, and I do not think he adheres to any particular belief system, but this is his natural conclusion, that we have to address the central problem of what we are. And what we did to the planet, what we have done to the planet, is a direct consequence of what we are. And that is the problem confronting us. And therefore, I will end with this long quotation of a great Indian thinker and philosopher. It is a long sentence, but I believe I have a couple of minutes to read it out because it is so important. It was written in the 1940s, and Sri Aurobindo, this philosopher, said, at present, mankind is undergoing an evolutionary crisis. This was 70 years ago, in which is concealed a choice for its destiny. Man has created a system of civilization which has become too big for his limited mental capacity and understanding, and his still more limited spiritual and moral capacity to utilize and manage. It's exactly almost the terms that Gus Spelt is using decades later. A too dangerous servant of his blundering ego and its appetites. Because the burden which is being laid on mankind is too great for the present littleness of the human personality and its petty mind and small life instincts, because it cannot operate the needed change, because it is using this new apparatus of science and technology, an organization to serve the old infra-spiritual and infra-rational life self of humanity, the destiny of the race seems to be heading dangerously, as if impatiently, and in spite of itself, under the drive of the vital ego seized by colossal forces which are on the same scale as the huge mechanical organization of life and scientific knowledge which it has evolved, a scale too large for its reason and will to handle into a prolonged confusion and perilous crisis and darkness of violent shifting incertitude. I would invite you to read that one sentence 10 times if you cannot grasp its import at once. Even if this turns out to be a passing phase or appearance and a tolerable structural accommodation is found, remember Glasgow, for example, tolerable structural accommodation is found, which will enable mankind to proceed less catastrophically on its uncertain journey. This can only be a respite, for the problem is fundamental, and in putting it, evolutionary nature in man is confronting herself with a critical choice, which must one day be solved in the true sense if the race is to arrive or even to survive. This is Sri Aurobindo in 1940s, and I believe this sums up better than I could have done this message and this necessary change. We have been told cultural, spiritual is something which India has had the keys of, has explored the methods of, and has given us ample message, and it is time that we turn to it. Thank you very much.